Okay, so we're going to look at how to set up lights for a VFX shot. This is what we're working with at the moment. So here is our sequence. So I'm just going to play a bit of it. So the thing we need to keep in mind first is what is going on with the lighting. So I can see we've got a lot of green screen here, which is fine. But we're going to CG this room, so we've got a scene with all our assets in there so far. This room on the left hand side, we can see these actresses walking through it, and they look pretty dark to me. You know, ignore the fact the green screen is bright. The green screen is bright just so we can key it out. So these people are dark, so the room we have on the left hand side, we need to make sure it has walls to create shadows for that area. This background area, we need to keep in mind that there is some light spill coming across there, so whatever is behind there in terms of VFX, there will be some light coming through from, you know, it could be an environment in the background, it could be a, you know, a landscape, but we would just have to, you know, monitor this lighting and just keep it consistent. The same goes for the far right hand side. You know, all this stuff here we're swapping out in CG. So all this area, we need to look at what's happening with the lighting. So in fact, if I add a color correct node to this, if I bump up the contrast, then I can actually see a bit clearer what is going on with the lighting. So as an extreme example, adding this contrast to it, I can see that this actress here is being hit by a spotlight. So I would assume that it's going to be the same one hitting this baby. So in the scene, in this, we do have an HDR, but we're just trying to look at the other lights. So there's probably a spotlight hitting down there, and it looks like there's another spotlight hitting this top roof bit. There's quite possibly another one hitting this side, because here it looks like it's vignetting to hit, you know, these people. We can see there's a strong fade off when the spotlight is hitting this actress, so we can make the assumption that we should probably add a light in CG going there, and then probably one up here, and maybe one here as well. The actor in the background looks pretty dark, so it might just be a case of keeping ambient lighting there as well. So yeah, off the bat, I would say, you know, we'd have the HDR, so that's light 1, light 2, probably the spotlight, light 3, the next spotlight, light 4, maybe another spotlight or softbox to hit this area. Light 5, we could have a slight light. It depends what the background is. You know, if the environment behind here on this left hand side is one area, then we would probably want to have a soft area light or softbox, something like that. That's just what I'm thinking at the moment, but we can see what it looks like in the end. But this is just the raw plate we're looking at now. Okay, so before I continue, I will say in this example I do have an HDR. So for anyone that doesn't have an HDR and is lighting VFX, I would say you just want to find an HDR that looks in keeping with the general lighting of your shot. And even if it's not that great, then you can just keep it at a lower exposure. There's a website which I can just show you now called HDRI Haven. There are a few others, but you can get some HDRs here. And if you do take a lot from this website, I would say donate to them. You know, it's really useful, but they have a whole bunch. So outdoors. So if I didn't have an HDR for this particular plate, I would probably just look at it and then scroll through the menus here and then pick one that was fairly in keeping. Okay, so what I'm going to do for anyone that doesn't have an HDR and they're watching this video, I would say go to the timestamps and skip ahead, because I'm going to take a look at my HDR. So I've actually put it in Maya already. So this is what the HDR from set looks like straight off the bat. I've increased the exposure to about 9, and we do have some reference below. So these are just cropped images of the chrome ball from set, and then the grey ball and the Macbeth chart. And fortunately enough, these were so these reference images are screenshots essentially from the filming camera. So the camera that was used to take the HDRs, that was just some Canon, and then the project was shot on an Alexa. So these are actually what the plate was shot with. So we need our chrome ball and our grey ball to look as close to these as possible. So you can actually see that we have the reflections in our chrome ball already are similar to to our reference. So in your scene, I would say whatever project you're working on, I would say if you've got all this other geo in there, you might want to put it on a separate layer. So I've put all my geometry on a separate layer, and I've so I selected it, and then I clicked display layer, create layer with selected objects. Then I double clicked on here to rename it to all scene geo, and then I pressed the V to turn it off. And if you've got any lighting in there at the moment, I would say delete it. I then created a Skydome. So to do that, go to Arnold, Lights, Skydome. Then in the Skydome on the right hand side, I added in my HDR, so in the color slot. So you go to color, you pick the HDR, so here is mine in there. If it is a true HDR image, your color space should be raw. So this is an EXR format, but it is 32-bit image that was actually converted. The original image, I think I re-exported it from an .hdr format. I then upped the exposure, because with an exposure of 0, so my default exposure of this looks very dark from what I remember. So this is the HDR straight from set, combined. And then if you do have reference from your on-set camera, then in this example, I just made a polygon plane, put it in front of my set, and then went to right click and added assign favorite material. I added a surface shader. This is just a flat shader, so you could do that. And in the shader, I renamed it. Remember to rename everything, so I called it onset ref shader. In the out color, I put in my image. So this image is just me getting the footage that was shot of someone holding these balls, and then the Macbeth chart on set, print screening, and just photoshopping together. So I've put that image in there. And what you could also do is in the shape of this plane, I should rename it. So I'll call this onset ref geo, something like that. In the shape tab, in the attribute editor, you can go to the Arnold tab, and we could turn all these off because we don't want our spheres to be influenced by this. This is purely there just for our own reference. So I'm going to turn all of these off, apart from primary visibility. We need to be able to see it. Once you've done that, create 2 spheres, put them somewhere in front of your scene. So I'm actually viewing through my render camera. So this render camera has already been tracked, and it's at the first frame of this sequence. So my render cam is viewing here, and I've put these shader spheres pretty much in front of it. So you create your 2 spheres. The first one, the grey ball, I'm just going to leave it with the standard Lambert, which gets applied to everything. and then the one on the left, I applied a Arnold standard surface shader. So you want to go to assign new material, go to the Arnold tab, and find a material called AI standard surface. Then in your presets, there's loads of different presets that Solid Angle have given us. So there's a chrome one, so you can scroll down to there and hit replace. And this pretty much just whacks up the metalness to 1. I think it might change the index of refraction possibly, but yeah. So after you do that, so you will have your HDR, and then you have your 2 shader spheres. In my instance, because the HDR is so dark, I see pretty much nothing apart from my reference plane. The alpha is pure white when I press the alpha button, because we do have our HDR image visible. It's because it might be useful in the next few moments. So I'm going to start by putting up my exposure to 9, which I think is what I had before. I'm going to minimize my render tab just so I can play with the settings. Okay, so now the process would be, I mean, I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but the process I would take to get nearer to this was I would start by trying to adjust the exposure of my HDR to get to a similar level to this image here. If I want to, because the lighting, because I know where this reference was actually taken on set, I could in fact move these balls to be closer to that location. So, or I could just duplicate them. So what I mean is, in my perspective, you can see the shader balls are here, and then I've got my reference here. This HDR was actually taken approximately there. So this is, some of this geo is just a rebuild of the set. So it's pretty much in the right sort of place. I couldn't actually remember where I placed these balls, but it looks okay. So in that case, what I can do is I should probably rotate my shader sphere. So I'm going to press play to render, and I can slowly rotate my shader, my HDR around. I could do it in the perspective, or I can change the rotate y-axis because we just want it to turn around in a 360 fashion. So as I alter this, you will see the rotation. I just want the because I know that this shader, this chrome sphere, is in the right place in set in relation to here. I'm just going to rotate it to be as near to the reflection that we've got in the reference. So we're getting there. So I'm changing the rotate Y to about, I think that's about right. And all I'm looking at is just the reflection. Because we have the HDR and we've got the reference, you know, the facts that I know are these screenshots here, they are from my camera. So we're trying to light CG in the same way that these are being lit, because this is on set. So knowing that, just to reiterate, I've placed a chrome ball and a Lambert in that same sort of location in order to match the lighting. So using the chrome ball with the HDR, we can now rotate this HDR to match here. And that looks pretty much okay to me. I might just reduce it by 5 in the rotation. But as you can see, the reflection is pretty much in the right place. I'm just going to try 65 quickly. Okay. So yeah, that looks pretty good to me. So then the next thing to change would be, I'll go into the exposure tab. I might just save a screen capture thing, so just so we can look where we've come from as well. So the exposure in my render looks a bit too bright, so I'll change it to 6. That looks better. But what you can see in our HDR, it's the white points are looking, it's in our plate it was a lot more orangey rather than our HDR. So what we could do is we could just use this as the base for our lighting, and then we could add in lights with a bit more color. But I think it would be beneficial to actually grade our HDR to be a bit more like this. So there are two ways we could do that. What we could do is we could load in Photoshop our HDR. So this is the HDR. And I'm just going to put up the exposure purely so I can see what's going on. So you can actually visually see where it was taken. Whoops. So the person was standing in between the baby and this doorway, and when we look at the plate, we can see, so they were standing about here in front of the baby and this door. So that's really useful. And brightening the HDR, we can actually see the lighting. So when I talked at the beginning of the video about predicting what lights would be used, I can actually see, in fact, if I just add some levels, tweak this bit, add a bit more contrast. Although it's a bit weird looking at it because it's a flattened out HDR, I could see there's lights here, there's one spotlight, there's another one. Then they actually have this big white sheet, which is kind of acting like a diffuse softbox almost. But this is just adding diffuse lights or lifting the shadows. So we could count that. So if we count the lights, so we've got HDR, so that's 1, spotlight 1, so that's 2 lights, another spotlight 3, then we have this sort of softbox type thing, so that's 4, there's another light, another mini spotlight in the green screen area, so that's 5, and I think that's it, so that's 5 lights. So I'll just double check that. So HDR, mini spotlight here, it's 2, spotlight again 3, spotlight again 4, and then this softbox thing. So using that as reference in this, I know not everyone watching this will have an HDR, but because we are lighting to the plate and we have the HDR, we must use it. So we can build our scene up from that. Once we grade the HDR a bit, then we can add in these other lights as our base point, really. Okay, so let's go back into Maya, and we've changed the exposure, so it would be good to change the HDR a bit to give us these sort of soft orange bounces, because an HDR is expensive to render because it's giving off a lot of global sort of lighting. So there's two things we can do. We could grade this in Photoshop or Nuke. So if I was going to do that in Photoshop, I'll quickly run over. So what I would probably do is I would get my onset reference, and we have the Macbeth chart, or we could use this as a reference. I could color pick from the whitest point, so like one of these, if I wanted the actual whitest points, or I could color pick from the white point here, because in my render the white points were looking very bright. If I just quickly jump in Maya, where is the render? So they're very harsh, so we just want to pull back those white points. because there's a lot of like orangey spill going on in the actual plate. So let's jump back into Photoshop. So if I was doing this in Photoshop as a quick example, I go to my onset reference, if you have any, and pick the whitest point, click OK. So I've changed my foreground color in the palette to this browny color. Then I'll jump back to the HDR, which is very dark. So I'm just gonna turn on this exposure, which is just to see it. I just want to be able to see. Okay, and then I'll create another adjustment layer in the bottom right hand corner, create a solid color, and by default it looks to my foreground color, which is this browny looking thing. So I'm happy with that. I click OK, and then I just want to blend it over. So let's try multiply. So now it's affecting it's actually going to affect all the colors, and it's adding a bit more of that warm browny orange look. You can see what's happening on the lights. So I'm mainly focused on these spotlights, but you can see it's actually softening the look, and it's giving us more of that tinge. So if I'm happy with that, then I could turn off my exposure and go File, Save As, do an EXR. So that's one way of doing it. Something else to quickly keep in mind is the green screen thing. I would recommend keying it out. You could Photoshop this, like just paint over it. I'm going to use nuke to remove and quickly key out the green screen, because this green is going to spill onto everything else. Okay, so as I've done this in Photoshop, this bit of grade, I'm just going to save this out. So I can save it because my original image was a EXR. This is a high dynamic range image. I'm just going to keep it as a EXR. Cool, so that's saved out. So what I'll just do is now back in Maya, I'm going to save a screenshot, and I'm going to load in my HDR. So just go into your dome light and load what you just saved. If you've done this in Photoshop, you could do the same process in Nuke, or I would just say we can just do this all in Maya. So I'll show you the Maya method as well, but I'm doing it in Photoshop initially because pretty much everyone has Photoshop. Okay, that's interesting. So because we have multiplied a color over, we will get a darker result. So that's before, so that's pre-grading, post-grading, but you can see we're getting these more orangey, browny values. Sounds looking pretty nice. So in my HDR, so select your dome, your Skydome. I'm going to leave it rendering. So when you press play, it will just keep on rendering by default. So I'm going to change my exposure. It was 6 before, and now I just need to bring it up a little bit to be more in keeping. So I think 9's slightly too bright, and 8 in the exposure was slightly too dark. Or maybe 8. Still looks quite browny in the HDR from set. So that's when the next adjustment would come in. So there's before and there's after. Before and after. So because I've left the visibility of the HDR in the background, you can actually see the result of the grade. So if you look at the bricks, like so this is the before image. if you look at the bricks here from the HDR, and then you compare them to what you can see of the bricks in these shots, you can see they're a lot whiter and flattened out. Whereas after the grade, we're warming up and becoming more in keeping with the color tones, like these small sample of brick you can see. Let's save another screenshot, a snapshot, whatever this is called. Great, so I'm going to stop the render for the moment. And what I can see is we have softened the lights off a bit. I believe this looks quite blurred out, but I think this is purely because the chrome ball, there's a lot of like smudging and grime on it, so we can't help that. We want to change the color of the what you call it, we want to grade it a bit more basically. So we can either jump back in Photoshop and continue that. We could probably layer up, we can use our color palette and you could regrade over. Or if we're happy with this as a base result, then we could color correct our HDR in Maya. So I'm going to do it that way. But it depends, if you are lighting for a sequence, like in a VFX film or something, then you would probably want to grade the HDR for that sequence. Okay, so I'll select with it Hypershade open. I will select my Skydome and display in and output connections, which is this button. So now we can see we have, this is our file we loaded, and then the Skydome. So within here, what we want to do is, in between this connection, there are a few utility nodes that we can use. So on the left hand side in the Arnold tab, you have all these utility nodes which have different uses. But all I want to do is color correct, so I can actually just hit tab and type AI color correct. And now I can intercept this connection. So I can draw a line out from my HDR to the input of this color correct, and then out back there. Okay, Maya's just thinking about that. The image will still look the same. All we've done is just added this in between into the connection, but we've not changed anything. So just to confirm that, I will render now. Save a snapshot. So yeah, nothing has changed. There's my before render, there's the after. So that's good. Okay, now with the AI color correct there, you just want to make sure you've selected it so that as you're rendering, well, it's harder for me because I'm recording this, so I have to do everything on one screen. So I just want to be able to manipulate the values on the side whilst rendering. So I'm going to hit play and let it begin to render. I don't actually need to render the entire image, so I'm just going to crop what I want to see. Okay, so it should just update that section now. And what I could do is start to play with the hue shift if we want to bring it nearer to a brown or yellow. So I'll just raise this slightly, just bit by bit, just to see what number might take us nearer to what we need. Or you could just drag this around a bit. I'm not exactly sure where the brown values would be because we don't have a visual display of the hue. So it might, in this instance for me, it's just a case of just shifting this nearer to wherever the yellow brown values are. So at the moment it's just completely destroying the hue. Okay, so going up from 1 is changing it to be a bit more blue. So reducing the number, what's that doing? So that's taking it more to purple. There is another way we could do this. If in the Skydome, what you can do is change the, there's a color balance section. If you want to see a visual version of the hue scale, then you could always go there. However, using a color correct node is a bit more useful, because if you're ever sharing a scene with anyone else, then they can actually see what you've done. Okay, let's see before and after. Okay, at the moment I'm not liking that, so I'm just gonna leave this on 0, and I'm going to change the exposure. Actually, not. Yeah, I'm gonna reduce this slightly. Okay, I'm gonna play with the saturation just to see what happens. Like maybe add a bit more. Because we did grade it, so we got the white point and we added to that. So it does seem like we might need a bit more saturation. Okay, that's better. That's a bit better. Like before and then after. Then we'll probably have to brighten it up again. But I'm just looking at the colors that we're seeing in the reflection here. So now we're pretty close. And I would say I'm quite happy with that. I think there would need to be a bit of slight hue shift. But it's a case of just playing around with it. Because we can see our grey ball is slightly off, but this is pretty close. I mean, let's look at where we started. Yeah, so this was the very start, so the rotation was wrong and everything. So that's before and after. Maybe I should do it before and after at this point, because we rotated it into the right angle and we decided that the white points were very bright, and you know, everything we needed to get more consistent with what it was actually filmed on. So this was taken with a Canon DSLR, and this is from our plate that was shot on an Alexa. So I think the last tweak would be to raise the exposure back up. So I'm going to take a snapshot of this render, and then in the left hand side select my Skydome and increase the exposure. So we do need it brighter, but then I still think there needs to be a little bit more of color correction, but we're pretty near. I mean, again, before and then after, like I'm looking at the shadowing. I probably should have turned cast shadows off from this chrome, because we're getting the shadows on there, which is a bit distracting. You could do that in the shape area of the sphere. Where is it? Cast shadows. There you go. Problem solved. But yeah, that's pretty close. So I think for setting up an HDR from set, I'm going to leave it there, and then in the next part we'll continue looking at this shot and adding lights for our VFX shot.